The scorching Dakota sun beat down mercilessly on Mason Thornton's weathered face as he surveyed the barren landscape stretching endlessly before him. 3 days lost in the Badlands, and his canteen had run dry that morning. At 52, the former Union cavalry scout had survived worse. Shiloh, Apache raids in Arizona Territory, even 2 years in a Confederate prison camp. But the treacherous maze of sun-bleached ravines and jutting rock formations had confounded even his expert tracking skills. His stallion Samson, once strong and reliable, now plodded forward on trembling legs, head hanging low as the relentless heat sapped what little strength remained in both man and beast. Mason's hand instinctively touched the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Only 4 bullets left, and hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement. "Just a little farther, old friend," he muttered, voice cracking from thirst as he patted the horse's sweat-lathered neck. The year was 1879, and the Dakota Territory remained one of the last truly wild frontiers of the American West. Mason had been hired by the Northern Pacific Railroad to scout potential routes through the territory, but a sudden summer storm had separated him from his surveying party 3 days earlier. Lightning had spooked Samson, sending them galloping into unfamiliar territory, and in the aftermath, Mason found himself hopelessly disoriented among the identical-looking buttes and canyons. He'd been wandering ever since, following what he hoped was a northward path back toward the railroad camp. But the twisting passages of the Badlands had a way of turning even experienced frontiersmen around. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the alien landscape. Mason's lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen from dehydration. He'd considered shooting Samson for water and meat more than once, but couldn't bring himself to kill the faithful companion who'd carried him through 8 years of frontier service. Instead, they pressed on as the light began to fade, with Mason scanning desperately for any sign of water, a patch of green vegetation, a flock of birds, anything that might signal salvation in this desolate wasteland. His vision had begun to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing before his eyes, the first warning signs of heat exhaustion that every frontiersman knew all too well. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm curious to know, what city are you watching from? It was then that Mason noticed something unusual in the distance, what appeared to be a thin wisp of smoke rising above a ridgeline. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. With renewed determination, he urged Samson toward the ridge, his heart pounding with both hope and caution. The Badlands were known Apache territory, and relations between settlers and natives had grown increasingly tense as white expansion pushed inexorably westward. Mason's years as an Army scout had taught him to respect the Apache as formidable warriors, but also as people with their own customs and codes of honor. He unbuttoned his holster, ready to defend himself if necessary, but equally prepared to approach in peace. As Mason crested the ridge, he was unprepared for the sight that greeted him. Below, nestled in a hidden valley invisible from the surrounding terrain, lay a small settlement unlike any Indian camp he had ever encountered. A dozen or so structures made of earth, timber, and animal hides formed a tight circle around a central fire pit. What struck him immediately was the absence of men. Women of various ages moved about the camp, tending fires, working on hides, and carrying water from a small spring that bubbled up from the earth. Children played among the structures, their laughter carrying faintly up to his position. Mason's brow furrowed in confusion. an Apache camp comprised entirely of women and children was unheard of in his experience. His momentary distraction proved costly. Before he could retreat or announce his presence, Mason felt the cold press of metal against his neck, the unmistakable touch of a knife blade. "Move and die, white man," came a woman's voice, speaking accented but clear English. Mason froze, cursing himself for allowing someone to approach undetected. Slowly raising his hands to show he meant no harm, he resisted the urge to turn his head. "I'm lost," he said simply, his parched throat making the words come out as little more than a whisper. "My horse and I need water." The pressure of the blade didn't diminish as several more figures emerged from hiding places among the rocks. All women, he noted with surprise, armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and what appeared to be captured army rifles. The woman holding the knife to his neck barked orders in Apache, and two others stepped forward to take Mason's weapons. They efficiently relieved him of his Colt, hunting knife, and the small derringer he kept in his boot, a precaution from his scouting days. Only then did the knife at his throat withdraw slightly, allowing him to turn and face his captor. She was perhaps 40 years old, with obsidian eyes that reflected nothing and revealed less. Her face bore the ceremonial tattoos of an Apache medicine woman, with lines of blue pigment tracing patterns down her cheeks. "Why are you here?" she demanded, studying his face with suspicious intensity. Mason explained his situation truthfully. The surveying party, the storm, his days of wandering lost. As he spoke, he noticed something peculiar in her expression, changing from hostility to what appeared to be wary curiosity. "The storm," she repeated after he finished. "4 nights ago?" When Mason nodded, she exchanged rapid words with the others. The discussion grew animated, with several women gesturing toward him, while others shook their heads vigorously. Mason couldn't follow their dialect well enough to understand, but the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, the medicine woman turned back to him, her expression now impossible to read. "You will come," she said firmly, leaving no room for discussion. "But if you try to escape or bring harm, you will die slowly." Mason nodded his understanding, too exhausted and desperate for water to consider resistance. 2 women took Samson's reins while others formed a guard around Mason, and together they descended toward the hidden camp. As they approached the settlement, Mason became aware of the stares directed his way. Curious, fearful, and in some cases, openly hostile. Children were hurriedly ushered into dwellings, and several older women watched his progress with hands resting on weapons. The medicine woman led him to the central fire pit and motioned for him to sit. A young woman approached with a water skin, offering it to him with downcast eyes. Mason drank gratefully, forcing himself to take small sips despite his body's desperate urge to gulp the precious liquid. After he had drunk his fill, a bowl of stew was placed before him, rabbit and wild roots, seasoned with unfamiliar herbs. Only then did the medicine woman seat herself across from him, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows across her tattooed face. "I am Nasha," she said, studying him intently as he ate. "This place has no name to outsiders. We do not exist to your world." Mason nodded slowly, sensing that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary and potentially dangerous. As the food and water revived him, his scout's instincts began to reassert themselves. He noticed details he had missed in his exhausted state. The unusual predominance of weapons, the defensive positioning of the dwellings, the way sentries maintained positions on the ridgelines above. This was not simply a camp, it was a fortress, designed by people expecting attack. "Why are there no men?" he asked, finally, setting aside the empty bowl. The question hung in the air like gunsmoke after a shootout. Nasha's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Mason thought he had overstepped. "The men are dead," she replied finally, her voice flat. "Soldiers from your fort came 3 summers ago. They said our people had attacked a stagecoach. It was not us, but they did not care. They wanted only to kill." Her eyes reflected the firelight as she continued. "They killed our warriors while they slept. Then our old ones. Then our boys who had not yet become men. Those who stand before you are all that remain of the Ghost Mountain Band." Mason's stomach churned at her words. He had heard whispers of unauthorized raids against peaceful Apache bands, atrocities covered up by corrupt officers and territorial officials. As a former scout, he had seen the aftermath of such pacification efforts and had eventually resigned his commission in disgust. The story was tragically plausible. "I'm sorry," Mason said quietly, knowing the inadequacy of his words even as he spoke them. "Not all white men approve of such actions." Nasha made a dismissive gesture. "Your sorrow changes nothing, but your coming, that may change everything." Before Mason could ask what she meant, Nasha rose and addressed the gathered women in their own language. Mason caught only fragments, something about signs, spirits, and what sounded like a prophecy. The reaction among the women was immediate and dramatic. Some fell to their knees, while others began animatedly discussing among themselves. A few approached to stare at Mason with newfound wonder in their eyes. The sudden shift in atmosphere left him profoundly uneasy. When Nasha turned back to him, her expression had transformed completely. Where there had been suspicion, there now shone something akin to reverence. "4 nights ago," she said slowly, "when the sky broke with light and thunder, I received a vision from the mountain spirits. They told me a man would come from the storm, a man marked by war but weary of killing. He would lead us to safety before the soldiers' return." She pointed directly at the long scar that ran from Mason's left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a Confederate saber at Chancellorsville. "The vision showed me this mark. The mountain spirits have sent you, Mason Thornton. You have come to save what remains of our people." Mason's blood ran cold at her words. He had encountered many things on the frontier: bloodthirsty outlaws, corrupt officials, renegade warriors, but nothing had prepared him for being proclaimed a divine messenger. "There's been a mistake," he began carefully, aware of the many eyes now fixed upon him with desperate hope. "I'm just a surveyor who got lost. I'm no savior." But even as he spoke, Mason realized the precariousness of his situation. These women had lost everything to men who looked like him. Their trust, newly formed and fragile as spun glass, might shatter at his denial, potentially with lethal consequences. Nasha was already shaking her head, unmoved by his protests. "The spirits do not make mistakes," she said with absolute conviction. "You came as foretold. Your denial changes nothing." Night fell fully as Mason sat by the fire, trying to make sense of his impossible situation. The women had provided him with a place to sleep, a small, clean dwelling at the camp's edge, but sleep seemed an unlikely prospect. Samson had been watered, fed, and picketed nearby, at least appearing content after their ordeal. Mason's weapons remained confiscated, though he was otherwise treated with a bewildering mixture of reverence and watchful suspicion. As the camp quieted and most retreated to their dwellings, Nasha approached him once more, seating herself beside him at the dying fire. For several minutes, they sat in silence, watching the embers glow and fade in the gentle night breeze. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "you will hear our story. Then you will understand why the spirits have sent you." Mason woke before dawn, his body's ingrained frontier discipline asserting itself despite his exhaustion. He stepped outside his dwelling to find the camp already stirring. Women carrying water, tending small cooking fires, or departing with bows and rifles for what he assumed was morning hunting. Though no one impeded his movements, he noticed that he was never without observation. At least 2 women always kept him within sight, their hands never far from their weapons. As he washed his face with water from a provided basin, Mason considered his options. Escape seemed possible. He could likely reach Samson and flee before being stopped. But the Badlands remained a deadly maze, and without guides or supplies, he would likely perish as he nearly had before. For the moment, he decided, cooperation remained his best strategy. Nasha found him as he finished a breakfast of dried meat and wild berries provided by a young woman who scurried away as soon as she delivered the food. "Walk with me," the medicine woman said. Not a request, but a command. Mason followed her to the edge of the encampment and up a narrow path that wound along the ridgeline. Neither spoke as they climbed, though Mason noted with professional appreciation the defensibility of the route. Narrow, exposed, and easily monitored from above. At the summit, Nasha stopped and gestured toward the horizon. From this vantage point, Mason could see for miles across the twisted landscape of the Badlands. A vista both beautiful and forbidding in the early morning light. "There," she said, pointing southeast. "Beyond those 3 tall spires, Fort Kearny, 25 miles as the crow flies." Mason nodded slowly, orienting himself. Fort Kearny had been established after the Civil War as one of the many frontier outposts meant to control the territory and its indigenous inhabitants. "And there," Nasha continued, pointing west, "the place our people called home for 10 generations, Ghost Mountain. A distinctive peak rose in the distance, its slopes covered with pine forest that appeared dark against the surrounding Badlands. 3 summers ago, a new commander came to the fort, Major William Grant. He believed all Apache should be eliminated or confined to reservations. When a stagecoach was attacked near the fort, he did not seek the true culprits. He led soldiers to our camp while our warriors slept and murdered them. Then the old ones, then our boys." Nasha's voice remained steady as she recounted the massacre, but her eyes burned with a cold fury that made Mason's skin prickle. 17 women and children escaped into the Badlands. "We have survived by hunting, raiding abandoned homesteads, and avoiding all contact with white settlers. We have buried 8 of our sisters in these 3 years, 2 from sickness, 3 from hunger during the harsh winter, 3 killed by soldiers during raids for supplies." She turned to face Mason directly, her expression challenging. "Now we are 23, 9 women who can fight, 5 elders, and 9 children. And each day we hear rumors that Major Grant plans to finish what he started. He tells his superiors he hunts renegade warriors, but there are no warriors left to hunt." Mason felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the leaden burden of witnessing humanity's capacity for cruelty that had driven him from military service. "If what you say is true, it's murder, not war," he said quietly. "There are laws, even on the frontier." Nasha's bitter laugh cut through the morning air. "Laws? For Indians? Tell me, Scout, how many white men hang for killing Apache?" She shook her head. No, there is only survival now. The spirits knew this when they sent you, a man who knows the ways of both worlds. The vision showed me you would lead us north, beyond the reach of Fort Kearny, to the Powder River country, where our distant cousins, the Lakota, might give us sanctuary. The journey is dangerous. Soldiers patrol the territories, and we are women with children. But with your knowledge of white ways and the land, there is hope. The magnitude of what Nasha proposed struck Mason like a physical blow. 150 miles of hostile territory with women and children in tow, evading army patrols and potentially hostile settlers, all based on a vision she claimed to have received during a thunderstorm. It was madness. Yet as he looked into her eyes, Mason saw something beyond fanaticism or desperation, a quiet, determined dignity that resonated with his own hard-won frontier pragmatism. These women had survived against impossible odds for 3 years. They were not fools or zealots, but simply people fighting to exist in a world determined to erase them. "You don't need me," he said finally. "You've survived this long on your own courage and skill." "Survival is not enough," Nasha replied, gesturing back toward the encampment, where children could be seen playing under the watchful eyes of the elder women. "The little ones deserve more than hiding and fear. They deserve to grow with their traditions, to know something beyond constant danger. The journey north is our only hope for that future, and the spirits have shown me you are the one to guide us." She placed a hand on his arm, the first voluntary physical contact since his capture. "I do not ask you to believe in visions or spirits, Mason Thornton. I ask you to believe in the right of these children to live free from the shadow of men like Major Grant. Will you help us? Not because spirits command it, but because it is right?" Mason stood silent for a long moment, weighing choices that seemed to have no good outcomes. His surveying party would be searching for him, perhaps even with army assistance. If found helping Apache women escape the territory, he could face charges of treason or inciting Indian rebellion, hanging offenses on the frontier. Yet the alternative, abandoning these women and children to the mercies of a commander with blood already on his hands, was unconscionable to the man he had become. The decision crystallized in his mind with surprising clarity. "I'll help you," he said finally. "Not because of any vision or prophecy. I'll help because what happened to your people was wrong, and what's being planned is worse." Relief washed over Nasha's features, quickly replaced by focused determination. "We must move quickly. The last new moon has passed, which means the army will soon begin its summer patrols of the territory." She started back down the path, speaking with renewed urgency. "We have prepared for this journey since my vision, gathering supplies, mapping water sources, planning routes that avoid settlements. What we lack is knowledge of army patrol patterns and safe passages through white territories." Mason followed, his mind already shifting to the tactical challenges ahead. The journey would require careful planning, perfect timing, and more than a little luck. The odds were long, but Mason had faced worse and survived. As they descended toward the camp, he found himself oddly at peace with his decision. The news of Mason's agreement spread quickly through the small community. While some still regarded him with suspicion, others approached with shy offerings: a beaded bracelet, freshly picked berries, a small carved wooden horse for his medicine. Mason accepted these gifts with appropriate solemnity, understanding they represented not just acceptance, but a transfer of desperate hope. That evening, gathered around the central fire, Nasha formally introduced him to each member of the band. The fighters came first. Kiona, an exceptional archer whose husband had been a respected war chief. Taluta, who had killed 2 soldiers with their own rifle during the escape from the massacre. Ayasha, barely 20, but already bearing a web of scars across her shoulders from a soldier's whip, and 6 others, each with her own story of loss and survival. The elders were presented next, women whose lined faces and gnarled hands spoke of decades of frontier hardship. Among them was Lalui, who Mason learned had been nearly 90 winters old and was the band's primary keeper of stories and traditions. Despite her age, her dark eyes remained sharp and assessing as she studied Mason with unnerving intensity. "She says you carry many ghosts," Nasha translated as the old woman spoke rapidly in Apache. "But good men always do." The children came last, ranging from a solemn 4-year-old boy to teenage girls on the cusp of womanhood. Mason noted how they clustered protectively around the youngest, their instinctive formation speaking volumes about the dangers they had already faced in their short lives. After the introductions, plans were laid for departure. The women had already determined what supplies could be carried and what must be left behind. Each fighter would bear weapons and essentials. The elders would carry medicinal herbs, seeds, and sacred items. The older children would be responsible for younger ones. 2 crude travois had been constructed for elders too frail to walk long distances. "We can cover 15 miles a day if we push hard," Mason estimated, drawing a rough map in the dirt. "The first challenge will be crossing the Little Missouri. The water is high this time of year, but I know a ford 20 miles northwest where we can cross safely." He outlined a route that would skirt the major settlements, utilizing the natural cover of ravines and forests where possible. As the planning session concluded, Mason found himself approached by Liluye, the eldest of the band. Nasha hovered nearby to translate as the old woman spoke, her voice surprisingly strong despite her years. "She says you must understand that we do not simply flee for safety," Nasha translated. "We carry the soul of our people with us, our stories, our ceremonies, our ways of being. If we reach the Lakota but lose these things, we will have failed just as surely as if Major Grant had found us." The old woman pressed something into Mason's palm, a small leather pouch containing what felt like stones. "Protection," Nasha explained. "Sacred stones from Ghost Mountain. She says even a white man needs spirits watching over him for such a journey." The next 3 days passed in a flurry of preparations. Mason found himself impressed by the efficiency and thoroughness with which the women organized their exodus. Nothing was overlooked. Water containers were checked for leaks, weapons cleaned and prepared, food dried and packed for maximum portability. He worked alongside them, repairing Samson's worn saddle, fashioning a second set of saddlebags from hides they provided, and creating detailed maps of the territory ahead. During these preparations, Mason gradually earned more of their trust, particularly after he demonstrated his skill at avoiding Army patrols during his scouting days. "The Army is like a clock," he explained. "Regular, predictable, and easily avoided if you know how they think." On the eve of their departure, Nasha led the band in a ceremony beside the central fire. Mason watched from a respectful distance as they sang songs in their native tongue, passed sacred items among themselves, and made offerings to the flames. The ritual continued late into the night, voices rising and falling in cadences both mournful and determined. When it finally concluded near midnight, Nasha approached where Mason sat beside his dwelling. Tomorrow we leave behind the last place many of us have called home, she said quietly. Some believe we will never find such safety again. They follow because they trust the vision that brought you to us. The weight of responsibility in her words was unmistakable. I will not fail them, Mason promised, hoping his resolve would be enough in the challenging days ahead. They departed before first light, a small procession winding its way carefully through the twisting ravines of the Badlands. Mason led the way on Samson, scouting the path ahead, while Kiona brought up the rear, erasing signs of their passage where possible. The youngest children rode double on the two strongest horses, while everyone else proceeded on foot. Progress was slow that first day, as they established a rhythm and order to their movement. Mason had insisted on absolute silence during travel. No talking, no singing, minimal noise of any kind that might carry across the open terrain. By midday, they had covered only 7 miles, and Mason's concern grew. At this pace, the 150-mile journey to Powder River country would take nearly a month, far too long to avoid detection. As they stopped to rest in the shade of an overhanging rock formation, Nasha approached him, clearly reading the worry on his face. The children will move faster as they adjust, she said quietly, and the old one's endurance will surprise you. Mason nodded, though his doubts remained. The harsh terrain of the Badlands would challenge even experienced travelers, let alone a group with elders and children. That night, as they made camp in a sheltered gully, Mason called together the adult women. We need to adjust our route, he explained, sketching in the dirt. Taking the eastern path through the Badlands will be slower, but offers more cover and water sources. We'll emerge near the headwaters of the Cheyenne River. Then follow it northwest toward Powder River country. The third day brought their first true test. As they crested a ridge shortly after dawn, Mason spotted dust on the horizon, the unmistakable sign of riders approaching from the southeast. Patrol, he hissed, dropping back below the ridgeline and signaling the others to take cover. The women reacted with practiced efficiency, herding children into natural depressions in the landscape while the fighters took up defensive positions. Mason crawled forward to the ridge's edge, withdrawing the old army field glass Nasha had returned to him. Through the glass, he could make out 6 riders in blue uniforms, moving at a casual pace along a dry creek bed, about 2 miles distant. They showed no signs of urgency or pursuit, suggesting a routine patrol rather than a targeted search. How did they find us? Taluta demanded when Mason rejoined the group, her hand resting on the captured army rifle she carried. They haven't, Mason assured her. It's a standard patrol route, exactly where I expected them to be. They'll continue south along that creek bed for another 3 miles, then turn back toward the fort. We'll wait here until they're gone, then proceed northwest, away from their path. His confident assessment seemed to calm the immediate tension, though many of the women maintained their vigilant postures. An hour later, the patrol had indeed turned south as Mason predicted, eventually disappearing from sight. As they resumed their journey, Mason noted a subtle shift in how the women regarded him. His knowledge of army movements had confirmed his value beyond Nasha's vision. For the next week, they made steady progress through the labyrinthine passages of the eastern Badlands. The women proved more resilient than Mason had initially estimated, covering 15 to 18 miles on good days. They traveled primarily at dawn and dusk, resting during the heat of midday and making cold camps at night to avoid the telltale glow of fires. Water remained the primary challenge, with Mason and the hunters often detouring miles to locate springs or seeps. Game was scarce, but sufficient. Rabbits, occasional deer, and once a young buffalo separated from its herd, which provided a welcome feast and fresh hides for the travelers. The children, initially frightened and subdued, began to show remarkable adaptation to their nomadic existence, turning the arduous journey into a series of games and adventures. On the 10th day, as they approached the northwestern edge of the Badlands, disaster nearly struck. A sudden summer thunderstorm forced them to seek shelter in a narrow canyon. As rain pounded the parched earth, water began to flow along the canyon floor, slowly at first, then with increasing force. Mason recognized the danger immediately. "Flash flood!" he shouted, already sprinting toward where the youngest children huddled under a rock overhang. "Higher ground, now!" The women reacted instantly, abandoning possessions to grab children and elders. Mason scooped up 2 small children and pointed toward a narrow game trail that switchbacked up the canyon wall. "There! Climb!" The water was rising with terrifying speed, already ankle-deep and gaining power with each passing second. The next minutes passed in a blur of desperate action. Mason made 3 trips into the rising water, helping elders to safety, while the other women formed a human chain up the steep trail. Samson and the other horses fought their tethers in panic, until Kiona cut them loose, slapping them toward higher ground where they might be recovered later. Just as the last elder was pulled to safety, a wall of water and debris roared around the bend of the canyon, obliterating everything in its path. From their precarious perch 50 feet above, the band watched in horror as their carefully packed supplies were swept away in the churning brown torrent. When the immediate danger passed, the toll became clear. They had lost nearly half their food stores, several weapons, and most critically, many of their water containers. As night fell, huddled beneath an inadequate shelter of pine boughs on the canyon rim, Mason called together the adult women to assess their situation. "We have 3 options," he stated plainly, knowing that sugarcoating their circumstances would only breed distrust. "We can try to recover what was lost and continue north as planned. We can divert to Fort Berthold and seek asylum. They sometimes protect peaceful Apache. Or we can return to your hidden valley and rebuild what was lost before attempting the journey again later." A heated discussion followed, with opinions sharply divided. Some argued that returning would mean defeat and eventual discovery by Major Grant's forces. Others insisted that continuing with depleted supplies was a death sentence, particularly for the children and elders. Throughout the debate, Nasha remained silent, her eyes fixed on Mason as the others voiced their concerns. When the arguments had exhausted themselves, all eyes turned to her for the final decision. "What does our guide advise?" she asked simply. Mason felt the weight of 23 lives resting on his answer. He thought of the terrain ahead, the remaining supplies, the strength of the travelers thus far. "We continue north," he said finally, "but we adjust our route to pass near Peterson's trading post on the Little Missouri. It's run by a fair man who trades with Indians and settlers alike. I've done business with him before. We can replenish essential supplies there without risking army entanglements." Nasha studied his face for a long moment before nodding decisively. "Then we continue north with the dawn." The following days tested the band's resilience to its limits. Water became precious beyond measure, with carefully rationed sips replacing the relatively comfortable allowances of before. Game grew more plentiful as they left the Badlands for the rolling prairie. But hunting required both time and ammunition, both now in short supply. Mason pushed the pace harder than before, knowing that reaching Peterson's trading post had become essential to their survival. The children no longer played during rest periods, but huddled quietly in whatever shade could be found, conserving energy. Even the fighters grew gaunt, sharing their meager rations with the young and old, while subsisting on almost nothing themselves. Through it all, not a single complaint was voiced. These women had endured far worse in their struggle to survive. On the 17th day of their journey, they crested a low rise to see the Little Missouri River snaking through the valley below, and beside it, the rough-hewn log structure of Peterson's trading post. Mason called a halt well back from the valley, gathering the women to explain his plan. "I'll go alone first," he said. "Peterson knows me, but he'll be suspicious of any large group approaching his post. Once I've secured his cooperation, I'll signal for you to bring the children and elders down. The fighters should remain hidden until we're certain of his intentions." Nasha frowned at this division of their already small forces. "How can we trust this white man? What prevents him from sending for soldiers once you reveal our presence?" "Peterson has no love for the army," Mason explained. "They tried to run him off his land 3 years ago, claiming he traded with hostiles. He fought them in territorial court and won. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "he's a businessman first. Your furs and crafts will interest him more than any reward for turning you in." After further discussion, a compromise was reached. Mason would approach alone, but Toluta and Ayasha would position themselves on the ridges overlooking the trading post with rifles, ready to provide covering fire if treachery emerged. With the plan set, Mason mounted Samson and rode openly down into the valley, forcing himself to project a casual confidence he didn't entirely feel. Jacob Peterson proved as pragmatic as Mason had hoped. After initial surprise at seeing a man he'd presumed dead in the Badlands, the trader listened impassively to Mason's carefully edited tale of encountering survivors from a massacre and helping them reach northern territories. He asked few questions beyond confirming they had trade goods and could pay for supplies. "Army patrol passed through 2 days ago," Peterson mentioned casually, as they negotiated prices for flour, coffee, and ammunition. "Said they were looking for Apache renegades supposedly hiding in the Badlands, offering rewards for information." He eyed Mason shrewdly across his rough-hewn counter. "Wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Thornton?" Mason met his gaze steadily. "Just helping some women and children reach their relatives up north. Nothing worth involving the army about." Peterson nodded slowly, seeming to reach some internal decision. "Well, I reckon what happens on the frontier ain't always the army's business. My wife was Crow, you know. Died of the fever 3 winters back. She had some notions about helping people that stuck with me." He began gathering the supplies Mason had requested, adding extra items here and there without comment. When the substantial pile was complete, he named a price far below market value. "Get these folks where they're going, Thornton. Too many graves in this country already." With Peterson's surprising generosity, the band's prospects brightened considerably. Fresh supplies meant restored energy, and the trader had even provided 2 additional horses to help carry the elders and youngest children. Most valuable of all was his information, detailed reports of Army patrol schedules and settler movements throughout the territories they would cross. Before they departed the next morning, Peterson approached Mason privately, pressing a folded paper into his hand. Map to a hunting cabin I keep about 60 miles north, he explained gruffly. Good place to rest for a few days if you need it. Nobody knows about it except me. Mason thanked him with genuine gratitude, recognizing the risk the trader was taking. As they prepared to leave, Peterson watched silently from the porch of his trading post, raising a hand in farewell only as they disappeared over the northern ridge. Their journey continued with renewed vigor over the next 2 weeks. The additional horses allowed for faster travel, and Peterson's detailed knowledge of the territory helped them avoid 2 army patrols and a large settler wagon train. They encountered their share of challenges: a lamed horse that had to be abandoned, a frightening night surrounded by wolves, a day when 2 of the children developed high fevers that only Lilue's herbal knowledge managed to break. Through each obstacle, Mason found himself increasingly impressed by the quiet strength of these women. They faced hardships that would break many experienced frontiersmen, yet they pressed on with a dignified determination that humbled him. More surprising was his own transformation. The initial reluctance to lead them had given way to a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't felt since his army days. As they entered Powder River country on the 32nd day of their journey, anticipation and anxiety gripped the band in equal measure. They were now in territory frequented by Lakota hunting parties, distant cousins to the Apache, but with no guarantees of welcome. Mason and Nasha had discussed this challenge extensively. The Lakota and Apache are not traditional allies, Nasha had explained, but we share enemies and some ancient kinship. If we can reach Chief Red Cloud's people and invoke the old protocols of sanctuary, there is hope. Finding Red Cloud's band, however, proved more challenging than anticipated. The Lakota were notoriously mobile, particularly in summer hunting season, and initial encounters with outlying camps brought cautious curiosity rather than immediate welcome. It was Lilue who ultimately bridged the gap. During an encounter with a small Lakota hunting party, the ancient woman stepped forward, despite her frailty, and began to sing in a language even older than Apache. A tongue Mason later learned was the ancient shared language of the Plains peoples. The Lakota hunters fell silent as she sang, their expressions transforming from suspicion to reverence. When she finished, the lead hunter approached and touched his forehead to hers in a gesture of profound respect. Words were exchanged in a mixture of hand signs and shared vocabulary, and within hours, the Apache women were being escorted toward the main Lakota encampment, where they were told Red Cloud himself would hear their story. The Lakota camp sprawled across a verdant valley, hundreds of teepees arranged in the traditional circle pattern of the Plains tribes. As Mason rode beside Nasha at the head of their small procession, he was acutely aware of the stares that followed their progress, curious, assessing, but not overtly hostile. Their Lakota escorts led them directly to the Central Council area, where a group of men sat in discussion. At their center was a figure Mason recognized immediately from newspaper illustrations: Red Cloud himself, the legendary war chief who had forced the U.S. government to sue for peace in the only war it ever lost to Native Americans. The chief's weathered face betrayed no emotion as the strange procession approached, though his eyes lingered thoughtfully on Mason's white face among the Apache women. What followed was the most extraordinary council Mason had ever witnessed. For hours, beneath the vast Dakota sky, Nasha and Lilue recounted the story of the Ghost Mountain Massacre, their years of hiding, and their desperate journey north. Red Cloud listened without interruption, his expression granite-like in its stillness. When they finished, he asked a single question, directed not at the Apache women, but at Mason. Why does a white man lead Apache women to Lakota lands? The question hung in the air like smoke. Mason felt every eye upon him as he considered his response. The frontier had taught him that only absolute truth would suffice in such moments. "I was lost," he said simply. "They found me. They believed I was sent to help them. I chose to do so because what happened to them was wrong." Red Cloud studied him with eyes that had seen a lifetime of broken treaties and white deception. "Many white men speak of right and wrong," he said finally. "Few act upon such words when it costs them comfort or safety." He turned to Nasha. "These women and children may remain with my people until the next spring. They will be given shelter, food, and protection as distant relatives. If they prove themselves worthy through their conduct and contribution, they may petition to stay permanently when the council meets with the spring thaw." Relief washed over the Apache women's faces at these words. Sanctuary, if temporary, had been granted. Arrangements were quickly made for their integration into the Lakota camp, with families volunteering to host the newcomers until they could establish their own lodgings. As the Apache women were led away to their new hosts, Mason found himself suddenly adrift. His mission completed, his promise fulfilled, he had no clear purpose remaining. As if sensing his uncertainty, Red Cloud approached where Mason stood beside Samson. "The white man's path lies elsewhere," the chief said, not unkindly. "Your presence here would bring questions from the Indian agents, questions that might endanger these women you have protected." Mason nodded, understanding the wisdom in the chief's words. The frontier had its own harsh logic. His continued presence could indeed jeopardize the very sanctuary he had helped the women secure. "I'll leave at first light," he agreed, though the decision brought an unexpected hollow feeling to his chest. That evening, as Mason prepared Samson for the journey south, Nasha sought him out. For a long moment, she simply stood beside him, watching as he checked the cinches on his saddle. "The prophecy is fulfilled," she said finally. "You have led us to safety as the mountain spirits foretold." Mason continued his preparations, unsure how to respond to talk of prophecies and spirits. "I just did what seemed right," he said eventually. Nasha's hand came to rest on his arm, stopping his movement. "Perhaps that is what the spirits knew you would do," she suggested, a rare smile softening her features. "Not all messengers know they carry messages. Not all saviors believe in their own purpose." Before dawn the next morning, Mason prepared to depart without ceremony or farewell. He had said his goodbyes to the women and children the night before, receiving small tokens of appreciation from many. A beaded bracelet, a carved wooden horse, an intricately woven basket. As he mounted Samson in the pre-dawn darkness, he was surprised to find Nasha waiting beside his dwelling. "The medicine road is long and often lonely," she said, pressing a small leather pouch into his hand, similar to the one Liluye had given him at the beginning of their journey. "But those who walk it with honor are never truly alone." Mason tucked the pouch into his shirt without examining it, somehow knowing it contains sacred stones from Ghost Mountain, a connection to the extraordinary journey they had shared. With first light breaking over the eastern horizon, Mason Thornton rode south from the Lakota encampment. From a ridge overlooking the valley, he paused for one final look at the sprawling camp where 23 Apache survivors would begin their new lives. He thought of Lilue's ancient wisdom, of Kiona's fierce protectiveness, of the children who might now grow up knowing something beyond fear and hiding. Whatever spirits or coincidences had brought him into their path, he found himself profoundly grateful for the encounter. The frontier had taught Mason many harsh lessons over his 52 years, but perhaps none so powerful as this. Sometimes being lost was the only way to find what truly mattered. With that thought, he turned Samson southward and rode into the rising sun, a changed man, carrying the quiet weight of 23 saved lives. As Mason rode away from the Lakota encampment, he couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary journey that had begun with him lost and dying in the Badlands. A lifetime on the frontier had taught him to believe only in what could be seen, touched, and proven. Yet his experience with Nasha and her band had challenged those hard-won certainties. Had he truly been guided to them by mountain spirits as Nasha believed? Or was it merely chance and desperation that had drawn them together? Mason fingered the small medicine pouch at his neck, feeling the smooth stones within. Perhaps the answer didn't matter as much as the outcome. 23 lives continued where otherwise they might have ended. As the Lakota camp disappeared behind him, Mason felt a sense of completion rare in his nomadic existence. For once, he had been part of something unquestionably good in a land where goodness often seemed in short supply. The frontier would continue its relentless transformation. Railroads pushing westward, settlements sprouting where only wilderness had existed, the old ways of life receding before the advance of what men called progress. Mason knew his own place in that changing world remained uncertain. But for 35 days, he had found purpose in leading a desperate band of survivors toward hope, and that experience had awakened something long dormant within him. As Samson carried him southward under the vast Dakota sky, Mason Thornton allowed himself a rare smile. The Badlands had nearly claimed his life, but in losing his way, he had found something far more valuable than any railroad survey could offer. He had rediscovered his humanity in the most unlikely of places, among a tribe of Apache women who believed he was sent to save them. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.